Hey everybody, welcome back to the Kutztown Christian Fellowship podcast. This week we'll be talking about how Easter is the defeat of death. In this talk, Dave Royce will walk us through 3 points: death and the real emotion of Jesus, death and the amazing answer of Jesus, and death and the final authority of Jesus. As always, a more descriptive outline can be found in the show notes down below. So open your Bibles to John chapter 11, verses 17 through 44, and let's get started.
You should have hopefully gotten an outline on your way in. On the inside of the outline, there is a passage from the Bible, which we're going to look at tonight. And this is going to prime the pump for our discussion together. So you'll definitely need a handout. If you don't have one, go ahead and put your hand up. Someone will go ahead and give you a pamphlet. I was sitting in a coffee shop this week, and I was sitting close enough to another table where, well, to be honest, I was just eavesdropping. You know y'all have done that. I was sitting close enough where I was able to overhear the conversation from a person who was sitting and talking on a cell phone literally right next to me. And it wasn't a creepy thing, but I heard this man talking on the cell phone, and I picked up from the way he was talking, he had an accent that immediately made a connection with me because I could tell he was from the same town that I was from. Because of this thing that we kind of had in common, I, this week, no joke, walked up to a random stranger in a coffee shop and introduced myself to him, right? It was kind of not awkward at all. I said, hey, you're from Kingston, aren't you? I'm actually born out of the country as well. And turned out that I talked to a dude who I had never met before. Not only was he from the same country as me, he went to the same high school as me. He grew up in a similar neighborhood as me, and he went to a different college, but he had the same major as me. And I don't know if that's ever happened to you when you immediately hit it off with somebody, but we talked for an hour. I talked to a random stranger for an hour, and the reason is because we had so much in common that the conversation just kind of flowed. We had all these little things in common. We had all these touch points of commonality that it never felt unnatural or awkward. It just kind of felt very, 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 very normal to talk to this dude, and it felt like I could talk to him forever about whatever. And I bet something similar has happened to you. Why is Dave talking about this? Here's why. Because people generally are easy to talk to when they have things in common. Yes? Will you give me that? In general, if you have a lot in common with somebody, it's easy to talk to them, which is why you find some people perhaps easier to talk to than others. Which is why on campus they have student groups that are drawn together around something in common. Maybe that's math or a political affiliation or something else that really draws you. Because when you get people who have something in common together, conversation is usually easy. Or at least I'll say this, conversation is usually easier because we all have this thing that we can all point to. We have that in common. That's true on campus. That's true on Facebook. That's true interpersonally. Here's why I'm sharing that. I've made this observation about our culture, and I think you'll agree with me, is that the interesting thing about growing up, or at least being in our culture at Kutztown, or at least maybe in North America, is that we all have something in common and nobody likes to talk about it. Can you see where I'm going? We all have this one really thing in common, and it's that all of us have a very set time to be alive. All of us, if you want to put it more abruptly, are going to die one day. All of us have that in common, regardless of your political affiliation, your race, gender, whatever. That is sort of an undeniable thing that you and I share, that all of us share. But here's the weird thing. I think you'd agree with me that conversation about death is actually not very easy flowing. As a matter of fact, culturally, it's a little bit awkward. Nobody starts a club about that, because that would be strange. And, I speak in front of a large group of people, even now, as I mentioned, hey, do you know we're all actually going to die one day? I can see the uncomfortable looks on your faces as I bring that up. Some of you are probably thinking, Dave, don't be morbid. And there is such a thing as a morbid obsession with death. But anytime someone brings about this idea that death is sort of a thing that you're going to have to think about and deal with, everyone's like, oh, don't be morbid. We don't want to talk about that. Even though we have that all in common, we tend to think about it that it's unhealthy to think and talk about. What I want to suggest to you that you see on this pamphlet here tonight on behalf of the Kutztown Christian Fellowship is that thinking about death is not unnatural. Actually giving it a thorough look in the eye is not weird and it's not morbid. I want to make the case to you tonight that the Bible says it's just the opposite. Considering death isn't weird, considering death isn't unhealthy, but actually I want to make the case to you tonight, before we do Q&A, that it's actually central to what it means to be a Christian. Let me qualify what I've said. Tonight I'm not going to talk to you about death. I guess that could be morbid. What you see on our posters and stuff around campus is that we're here to talk about Easter. We're here to talk about the fact that at the heart of Christianity, Easter is the defeat of death. And that's reason why Christianity exists and why Christians are a people of joy and rejoicing. I want to show you that from the Bible, and this is the time where you should open that little handout pamphlet thing. And really, if you can, I'd love for you to just follow along as I read this somewhat long passage, but I want you to follow along with an account in the Gospel of John that is going to illustrate this point very, very well, and will set us up to talk about it in Q&A in just a minute. This is from John chapter 11, and begin at verse 17. I'm going to read this whole thing that you see printed there on the left side of your handouts. Here we go. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near to Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and she met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Verse 27, she said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who's coming into the world. Now, when she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and he's calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and he was greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb, and it was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, because he's been dead for 4 days. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. That's a great passage, isn't it? Those words were written by John. John is an eyewitness of Jesus. John is one of the disciples of Jesus. He's a person who knew the historical Jesus Christ. And he wrote these words down so that people would come to believe in Jesus. And the text that I want you to take you through this little passage tonight, the text centers on 4 characters. Maybe that's very obvious to you, but I just want to name the 4 people that this passage primarily surrounds. Number 1, this passage surrounds a person named Mary. Number 2, this has a person in it named Martha. Number 3, a very important character in this story is Lazarus. And number 4, probably most important of all, this is a text about Jesus. Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus. Here's what you need to know. Mary and Martha are sisters. Lazarus is their brother. And tragedy has struck this family because Lazarus has died. Verse 17 picks up the narrative here. There's more you could read before, but verse 17 picks it up by saying not only has Lazarus died, there's this detail that he has been dead for 4 days, which means he is not only dead, he is decaying. And what follows is 23 verses about a time when Jesus looks at death, which is important for us to think about. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and John includes that because this is not an accident. It's not like you can say, oh, those people didn't really know a dead person. Like maybe after 1 day, some people might come back and like, I was just sick, JK. That's not what this is. The man is really dead. And Jesus is confronted with that in his lifetime. And you might say, is John just being morbid? Why would John write this? Is this Christian propaganda? Why is John including this in the account? And the main point of the passage, and here's what we're going to maintain tonight, is that Jesus' view of death gives us the clearest picture of how we should live our lives. That's why John included this. That's the main point. John wrote this because the way Jesus looks at death is actually the clearest picture for you for how you should think about your life right now. Now, let me show you that. In this passage, Jesus has an emotion towards death. Jesus has an answer for death. And number 3, Jesus has authority over death. Look at the outline. Flip to that side of your pamphlet real quick. Jesus views death in this text with a very particular emotion. I want you to draw attention to that. Take it from the top. Look at verse 17. Listen for some emotional language here. Look, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, so he's really dead. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them concerning their brother. Okay, the mood in the passage is sad. Just pause there real quick. The mood is very sad. All throughout the passage, we get words like weep and console, and if you had been here, and remorse. Emotional language. Mary and Martha are understandably emotional. There's pain, regret, loss. But I want you to look down at verse 32. Something very important happens, which not a lot of people have thought about. Look at verse 32. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 33 is incredibly important. When Jesus saw her weeping, underline the word saw if you're an underliner. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, here it is, Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit, and he was greatly troubled. Surprise, guess what? Who's the saddest person in John chapter 11? It's Jesus. That's a surprise in the narrative. It's a surprise to learn, maybe you're surprised, that God actually sorrows over death. That Jesus, the Son of God, is moved in this passage. Even like he knows all things, he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Wait a second, verse 33 says he saw and he was deeply moved and greatly troubled. The other key phrase to underline is deeply moved and greatly troubled. Your English translation is struggling to convey something that happens in the original language. In the original language, those words, deeply moved, are really, really interesting. And let me just nerd out with you for a second here. If you are fascinated by original language stuff, when it says that Jesus wept in the Bible, you're not supposed to imagine like Jesus is like, he's just like he gets a little misty-eyed and sorrow and weepy. He is deeply moved and greatly troubled. Probably a best translation of this is, excuse my language, Jesus was pissed off. Other translations of the Bible, actually, most other translations say something like Jesus Christ was outraged when he saw people sad because somebody died. You could translate it that Jesus felt in his being a snarling sorrow. You know when you're mad at something and you make this sound? It's like this. Ah, that. That's what deeply moved and greatly troubled means. That's what your translator is trying to communicate to you. That Jesus Christ, in his life, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, is kind of pissed off that death has intruded into people's lives. And that teaches us something very, very profound if we're ever going to think about Easter and we're going to convey and converse that we have this thing called death in common. It's on your sheet. We learn here that humanity was actually not designed for the grave. Why would Jesus sorrow or be outraged looking at death? The reason is, as the creator of the universe, he's saying people were not designed to die. You could say death is natural, and we all have that in common, but the Bible would actually say that death is actually kind of unnatural. Death is actually kind of wrong. Death actually should tick you off as well. I have young kids, I tell them things like this. Hey, guys, crayons, not designed for the TV. Cool? They like to color on the TV. PB&J, not designed for the DVD player. They like to, right? It's very inconvenient. What's Jesus saying here? Human beings, not meant for death. It's a profound idea. It's a profound idea. This is why if you've ever been to a funeral, you feel something like this. This is wrong. This is why if you've ever been to a funeral or seen, open casket moments, you look at a corpse, if you've ever seen a corpse is vacuous and kind of upsetting. This is why if you've ever been confronted by death or upset by it, you should be upset by it. That's what I'm saying. A friend of mine lost his spouse in a rock climbing accident once. And I just feel nauseous thinking about that, right? Some of us on staff, a friend of ours just had their first child who died a couple moments after they were born. And you don't think about that and you're like, okay, well, whatever. No. You think about that and your insides kind of curl up and your outsides kind of snarl. That's what Jesus is doing here. That's what it means when it says Jesus wept. The Christian view of death, let me just be upfront and honest if you're new to Christianity. The Christian view of death is that death is an intrusion to God's original plan. Death is wrong. And you know it. You don't need me to tell you that. When someone does a horrible thing, like shoot up a school, everybody says, that is wrong, and we should say that. That's why, even if you're like, oh, I'm an atheist, I don't think there's God, I'm a total atheist. Even total atheists, when their lives are threatened, tend to say, oh my God. Nobody is going to be like, death is just sort of natural. Just shoot me. I know you're shooting up the school and stuff. I'm an atheist. It never happens that way. There's always a sense of, this is not right. Please don't kill me. Don't take another life. That is inherently wrong. That's because, let me drop some theology on you. Human beings were designed, created, and crafted to live in a right relationship with God. You weren't meant for the grave. Humanity is special, and death is an intrusion. It is a universal problem. And number one point we got to get is Jesus sees death, and he is mad. But we could ask the question tonight, have you ever sorrowed over death? Have you ever gotten to the point where that has sort of either directly or indirectly touched your life and it has made you mad? Listen, our culture shields us from death. People who are close to it, we tend to shuffle them off elsewhere so you don't actually have to see it, which is why if you're in your 20s, you might be like, never really seen it, never really thought about it, no big deal. And if that's you, I'm here to tell you, it will make you sad one day. You will have to think about this. It is an undeniable confrontation that will meet you, which is why one of the most profound verses in the Bible is John 11:35. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. It's 2 words. Jesus wept. And that's actually a good description of Easter. You ever thought of that as an Easter passage? That is a really good picture of Easter, because Easter is God is snarlingly mad at death, that he has come at Christmas to do something about it at Easter. Jesus is going to wage war against death. That's why he showed up. That's the point of his incarnation, that he is so moved that he's going to do something about it. Jesus views death and he has a real emotion. That's point number one. And here's the turn and another surprise in the passage. Point number two, look at the text. Jesus not only has an emotion towards death, he also claims to have the answer to death. This is really ridiculous. The second point in your outline is death and the amazing answer of Jesus. Death and the amazing answer of Jesus. We could ask this question: how does Jesus interact with sorrow, sadness, and tragedy? Well, look at verse 23. Everybody is sad. Someone has died. Verse 23, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Please look at verse 25. It's a really important verse. Look at this. John writes that Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Verse 25 and 26, I think, are some of the most outrageous verses in the whole Bible. Because Jesus just threw it down if he just said that, right? That's a drop the mic moment. Can we just agree? Jesus does not say, oh, wow, you're so sad. You know, I'll pray for you. You know, like when someone's really sad, it's difficult. It's kind of awkward. Like someone is weeping, and what do? You're like, I give you a hug. I'm sorry for your loss. I'll write you a card. And if there's anything I can do, let me know. That's typically how people interact with tragedy. So we're looking at this, and we should say, how does Jesus interact with personal tragedy and death? You know what the answer is? Jesus interacts with tragedy by calling attention to himself. And you can either say Jesus is the most narcissistic man who's ever walked the planet, or you could say, I need to really think about this. Because here's the claim. Jesus not only has an emotion towards death, Jesus is saying he has the answer to the universal problem that has affected the human race called death. He's saying, I have the answer. In your sadness, look to Jesus. That's what he's saying. And that's an outrageous claim. And let's just put the microscope over it to make sure we understand what he's saying. Look at the words of Jesus in verse 25. I've put a couple quotes on your outline sheet here. The first thing that Jesus says is he says, quote, I am. Before he says resurrection and life, I just want to stop and draw attention to the fact that here Jesus Christ says, quote, I am, in verse 25. You all have seen professors who repeat themselves in classes, yes? You know what professors repeat? Things like, I just want to let you know, this is on the final. And everyone's like, okay, what, final, right? And they repeat that all throughout the semester to try to let you know, this is really important, you need to remember this, and they drop these hints. It's finals time. If that's happened, you should pay attention when your professor says that. Okay, Jesus has been doing something like that all throughout the Gospel of John. You know what Jesus' repetition is? I am. All throughout the Gospel of John, no less than 7 times, there are these I am moments where Jesus says, I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And here he says, I'm the resurrection. There are all these I am repetitions all throughout John's Gospel. He's doing that to make a connection to a Jewish audience. Look at the top of your sheet. I put Exodus chapter 3 there. Jesus is saying I am to bring about the ultimate throwback Thursday, okay? Because look at the top of your sheet. I've printed Exodus 3. And remember, Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience. Exodus 3, that quote at the top, says this. There the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire from a bush. Ever heard of the burning bush? Anybody? Yeah? This is it. Okay, here we go. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. That's weird. Verse 14. God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent you. Many of us, if you grew up in church, have a vague familiarity with this whole like burning bush in the Old Testament thing. And most of us think that's just like a weird wonky story. Bottom line, God introduced himself to Moses in the Old Testament with this phrase, I am. Why is that important? Because Moses said, God, what are you really like? How am I supposed to do this? And God's answer is, What am I like? I am. That's God's answer of who he is like. If you want to know what God is like, the answer is I am. It's the Hebrew word for to be. It means I will be, or I am. And a burning bush that is not consumed, that's kind of a strange thing. That's an illustration of God. Think about it. God is saying, like a burning bush that isn't burned up, God doesn't run on anything. God doesn't need fuel. God doesn't have to consume something to exist. That's the object lesson. Ultimate throwback Thursday, Exodus chapter 3 for Moses. God is saying, God in his essence is life. Think about that the next time you have to eat dinner, by the way. You have to consume something for you to have life, yes? That's not rocket science. That's just sort of how it works. And Jesus is saying, actually, Yahweh, what the Jews call Yahweh from Exodus chapter 3, Jesus is saying, that be me. Outrageous thing to say. What an outrageous thing to say. Jesus here is claiming to be the one true God that the whole Old Testament is talking about. That's what he means by I am. I am. I am. Remember that whole in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light. Jesus is like, that'd be me. And so a dead man walking out of a grave is no harder than making all things out of nothing. Jesus says, I am. That's jaw-dropping. And then here's the other half of that same phrase. Look at the other thing on your sheet. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. He doesn't just stop and say, I am. That'd be cool enough. But he says, I am, but I am the resurrection and the life. What's important about that? Think about it. Jesus does not say, I'm going to cause a resurrection. Jesus says he is the resurrection. The coming of Jesus of Nazareth in space, time, history is God's plan to defeat death. It is God's renovation of all things in this world, including your body. That's who Jesus is. And it is a bombshell of a statement. I don't know if you've ever thought about Jesus like that, because this is a pretty significant claim. When I was a kid, we all have a crazy uncle. I had a crazy uncle who was into investing in real estate, right? And no joke, we heard that crazy Uncle so-and-so was going to buy some house. I don't know if he was going to flip the house, but he was going to buy this property and stuff, and he was going to fix it up. So I went with my dad when I was a kid with crazy Uncle so-and-so to go look at this house. And I was expecting, he's going to buy this house. It's not going to be this bad. We walk in to this horrible looking house. The grass is like this high. I'm only this high. So I'm walking in, and I it was probably not that high, but I just remember I'm in the jungle because that grass is past mowing. That's like baling, right? You got to bale the grass. There is a keep out sign in front of this house. I think the house was condemned. And I'm like, this place is haunted. Uncle so-and-so says, it's beautiful, isn't it? Are you on drugs? What is wrong? It's like, this is perfect. Look at the location. Look at this. I see the structure there and all that. This is exactly what I want to do. It's not irreparably damaged, or maybe it is, but I'm going to just start this absolute awesome renovation project. And we all thought he was weird. He has a house there. It's worth quite a bit now because he has totally brought about, I would say, a resurrection. And listen, friends, in a much greater way, Jesus is making that claim here. He is saying to Mary and Martha, he's saying that about himself and what his mission is on earth. Maybe you could think of it this way. All of us wear a sign called condemned, don't you? All of you have a keep out sign on your heart. All of you live in such a way where you know that there's something in you. I don't have life in me. I can postpone it, or I can use makeup. I can try to find the apple of youth or the fountain of youth, or I can do whatever it is. But my life is moving towards ruin, and I may as well have a condemned sign on me. I'm kind of awkward. I kind of want to keep you out of my own life. But here comes Jesus, and he says, my mission is to lift the label of condemnation that is on you. And he wants to begin a work of resurrection and renovation in you, because that's who he is. I am the resurrection and the life. And look at the second half of verse 25. We're like, okay, so what does that mean practically, Dave? Let me tell you. Verse 25 says, whoever, Jesus speaking, not me, don't shoot the messenger, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Let's think about that. Jesus is saying something there about a Christian's future. He's saying that Jesus will bring you to a point of life out of a future death. That means with Christ. There's hope as you look ahead. It means in a relationship with Jesus, know for sure there is life after death. That's what the man promises. Dying is not a termination. It does not get the last word. Lazarus is a demonstration of that. And Jesus seems here to view death kind of like a good night's sleep. Because he is the resurrection. He says, whoever believes in me, though he die in the future, yet shall he live. You have hope for that time when you cross death. But look at verse 26. He goes even further. And he says, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Well, if verse 25 is saying something about the future when you die, verse 26 is very much saying something about the present. What is this claim? He is saying that rising from the dead, death and resurrection is something that you can understand and cling to right now. Because Jesus is the resurrection, there's this pattern that death never has the last word, and your life is never actually ruined because out of death comes life. That's Jesus, and I have my faith in him. That means I can view my life right now as never hopeless. Do you know that? You know hopelessness. You know those times when storm clouds just roll into your life? You're a Christian, let's say, and you fail a class. Sorry if that's too close to home right now for some of you. That's not death, but let's be honest, that kind of feels like death. You're like, crap. I feel like I'm ruined. Well, guess what? Failing a class, if you are in Christ, will never knock you out, because everyone who lives and believes in Christ shall never die. You can say, you know what? I expect that in Christ, he's going to bring about a resurrection, even from what I think right now is hopeless. Jesus brings life out of death, and you can say, I'll rise again. Right now, the interpretation of my life is not hopeless. It's not condemned. It's not keep out. Well, let's say you're driving along the road and you total your car. You're like, I'm kind of broke. How am I even going to get to work, right? Okay, that's not death. Maybe you didn't die. But something about that just feels like death, doesn't it? And you're just sad. What about if you're devastated because a relationship ends? Storm clouds roll in. What if you get the news and you hear something like, I'm sorry, it's cancer. Can't help you. What happens in that moment? In that moment, we say, Jesus Christ really is the bringer of hope. We say that Jesus brings us through death to life, and hopelessness does not have the final answer. You're allowed to look at your life as a pattern of death and resurrection as well. See, Jesus really is the bringer of hope and joy and lasting outlook of eternal life. Friends, here's the application of this. I think in Christ, we're always allowed to say this. Always look for life out of death. Always look for life out of death. Always look to know that to know Jesus is to have true hope, because the worst enemy that you can imagine is defeated. So nothing in this life will ever knock you out. That's Christianity. And I don't know who talks like this except the Son of God. I'm willing to bet that some of you who have wandered into this room tonight, if you're a Christian or you're not a Christian or wherever you are in that spectrum, I think some of you have a cloud of hopelessness that hangs over your head. Listen, I have good news tonight. Jesus Christ is the bringer of hope. Both for the Christian and the non-Christian, both for wherever you are. And my challenge or question to you would be, if think about the thing that you feel most hopeless about right now, where you most feel out of control and like it's careening towards ruin. Here's the question. Can you trust the one who raises the dead? And that question breathes oxygen into your life, and it says, I absolutely can. Jesus spoke creation into existence. That's the I am. Jesus brings life out of death. That's the resurrection and life. Knowing Jesus is like having oxygen. So practically, what are you supposed to do with this? Especially if you find yourself outside of the faith. There's a third thing that I quoted on your outline. Jesus says, I am. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Here's the last thing. He says, believe in me. Did you see that? The passage makes a very, very clear appeal to you, both to insiders and outsiders, both to Mary and Martha, as well as anybody who would read this book. Jesus is saying, listen, so what do you got to do? Believe in me. Can I give you an illustration of that? All right, in English, some words make no sense by themselves. Some verbs. Here's an example. So, think of it this way. In English, some verbs can stand on their own, and some don't make any sense by themselves on their own. Here's an example. If you say, when I go home from KCF tonight, I am going to study. That makes sense, right? You use the word to study, and it just stands on its own. I am going to study. You're like, okay, that verb can stand alone on its own, and that you still make a good deal of sense if you say, I'm going to go home, and I'm just going to study. Cool. If you came in here tonight and you said, I'm so tired, it's been a long day. When I come to this KCF Easter thing tonight, I'm just going to sit. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because sit is just sort of open-ended. It's non-communicative. You can just sit and everyone knows what you're talking about. Cool. Okay, stick with me here. There are other words in English that make absolutely no sense if you use them by themselves without an object. If you said, I'm going to come to KCF tonight, when I go there, I'm just going to avoid. There's a natural question. You'd be like, avoid who? And the answer is, of course, avoid Dave, because he's weird, right? And you see, avoid doesn't really make sense if it's just standing alone by itself. There's some verbs that are just like that. Here's another one. Hey, I can't wait for summer break. When I go home, I'm going to find. You'd be like, smack, find what? You can't just find. You have to find. It needs an object to complete it. And of course, the natural object is I'm going to find a job because I'm broke. Okay, do you see the illustration? Some verbs make sense by themselves. Some verbs do not make any sense by themselves on their own. This is why in the Bible, the word believe makes no sense by itself. Let me say that again. In the Bible, in the New Testament, when you see that word, believe, it makes zero sense on its own without an object. Well, that's weird because in our culture, it's kind of popular to say, well, I don't go to church, I don't really read the Bible, but don't worry, I still believe. I still have faith. The natural question is, in what? In who? Or what is the object of your belief? That's how the word believe is used in the Bible. It's the same word for faith, or to put your faith into something. That's why very, very, very clearly in this passage, no less than 3 times, Jesus says, don't just believe. He says, believe in me. Believe in him. As a matter of fact, it's stronger in the original language. John wrote, believe into Jesus. That's what John wrote. He didn't just say in, he says believe into, not in general, but specific. Bottom line, if you're hopeless, Jesus is saying the answer is not generic belief. The answer is not just faith in God, hypothetical. It is believing into Jesus Christ. That's the answer. If you want this whole happy Easter thing, if you want to get what this is all about, it's not an emotion. It really isn't. Although emotions are fine. Believe means you shift your weight, you put your trust, you point your life into Jesus. And you move it from yourself, maybe from your intellect, from your emotion, maybe from your tradition, and it's like coming home to Christ. That's the call. Come into his words. And verse 26, here's this very edgy question. Look at it. Verse 26. Jesus looks at these people, and did you see what he says? Do you believe this? It's a great question. He's not saying, Mary and Martha, do you have a nice fuzzy feeling in general? That's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying, do you believe this? Do you believe me? Which is a wonderful question. And I think that is a helpful thing for us to think about tonight. It's that even if you've grown up celebrating Easter all your life, even if you're a church kid, even if you're the most anti-Christian atheist, here's a question. Jesus looks you in the eye. Everybody, myself included. Do you believe this? Do you believe this? We kind of all have to face that question in some ways. Apathy is to answer the question. Because you, even if you have a Christian background, even if you've been to church or never been to church, you actually need to answer that question and call on Jesus as an individual and have God look at you and say, do you believe this? Have you believed into Jesus? How do you do that? Well, it means saying to Jesus, listen, I don't know that I have everything figured out. I don't know what that weirdo is talking about tonight completely, but here, I know this. I know I don't have life in myself. I know that my life, there are things that are really, really hopeless. God, would you remember and raise me? That's believing in Jesus. And the question of this is, have you done that? Friends, none of us actually know. How do I say this? Nobody actually knows how long you have to live and how many days you've been given. That's fair. It's not morbid. It's kind of what's going down. There's no guarantee any of us will be here next year, or that we could ever get this same group of people together again, which is why that question exists. Jesus says, I am. Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. And he says, believe in me. So here's the question. Have you, do you believe this? Jesus says that is the most sane way to live your life, because that's how he views death. Jesus has an emotion towards death. He views death with a particular emotion. Jesus has an answer for death, and it's himself. That's the claim. He has an emotion. He has an answer. Last thing, he has a claim to authority. Let's close with this. Death and the final authority of Jesus. Verse 38. This is how the passage ends. Look at what's going down, and then we'll get to Q&A. Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha brings up a good point. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, because he's been dead for 4 days. Very good point. Verse 43 says this. When Jesus had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. I want to draw your attention to another weird, surprising thing. I just read it. Maybe you found it weird. I certainly find it weird. The passage makes zero mention of Lazarus' response. Like, if you were writing Christian propaganda, wouldn't you be like, and then Lazarus was like, right? Thanks. We have no idea if Lazarus is happy, if he's sad. He's like, what's going on? We don't know. John is silent on it. And that says something. The reason of that is because the focus of the end of John chapter 11 is on Jesus' authority to do it, not people's necessarily emotion towards it. And this is recorded that to remind you that you need to recognize that Jesus views death from a position of authority. That's the point. Jesus views death from a position of exalted king of the universe, kind of, where he actually gets to say what goes down. In other words, he's saying this is a preview of what's going to happen from here forward in the life of every human being. Because as you know, Lazarus dies, rise from the dead. Why would you do this, Jesus? Why not let the guy die? Other people died. This is written as a preview account to know that what's going to happen at Easter is Jesus is going to die and rise from the dead because God has authority over death. This is a preview passage of Jesus' resurrection. And I want to also say this is a preview passage of something that the Bible calls the final resurrection. What do I mean by that? I mean, you too are going to rise from the dead, whether you like it or not. That's the account of the Bible. I didn't make that up. Look at John chapter 5. I put it on your outlines. This is earlier in the same book. This is in the background of John 11. John 11 happens with this having already gone down. John 5 says, Jesus, quote, do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. And those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. You ever been in a courtroom? I've been in a courtroom one time in my life. Here's what goes down in a courtroom. It's a sober place because, man, people's destinies are determined. You know what I'm saying? There's one really important person in the courtroom. It's the judge. And everybody, maybe they're quiet or somber, maybe they're like looking up, or whoever or whatever is in a courtroom. There's this moment where the judge walks in, and you know what someone yells? All rise. For the judge. And you get up and you recognize that's the judge, because what he says kind of goes down. Authority, 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 all rise. Jesus Christ made the claim in this book, don't shoot the messenger, my job is to tell you the truth, that there's a day where he is going to say, all rise. For the judge, the one who has all authority. And Lazarus come out is a preview of the time when Jesus is going to say, everyone come forth. One commentator says it's a good thing he put the word Lazarus there, because if Jesus had just said, come out, every grave would have, right? Everyone would have just shown up. But it's fair for you to read this and say, here's the future. What Christians think of as the end of Jesus' return is synonymous with Dave come out. Of everyone, regardless of who you are or what you've done, everyone will appear before God because Jesus has authority. And everything to do with who lives and who dies has been turned over to him. So friends, what does Easter mean? It means there's hope. It also urgently reminds you, you were not made for the grave, you were actually made for God. And if you have not, you need to come home to God in Jesus by asking him, the one with authority, to make you alive. Happy Easter.